The story opens on Veterans Day in Kerrville, Texas, where Master Sergeant Harold "Red" Becker, a revered 74-year-old Marine veteran, stands in his pristine dress blues at Maplewood Park's memorial ceremony. Despite his quiet demeanor, his lifetime of service, including tours in Vietnam and the Gulf, and his Purple Heart are well known. The solemn atmosphere shatters when a young protester, yelling, "That uniform is a murderer's costume!" hurls red paint at Harold's chest, splattering his medals and ribbons. Unflinching, Harold simply closes his eyes for a moment. Then, with a deliberate motion, he pulls out an old military flip phone, makes a call, and signals that what just happened is not over. The very air seems to hold its breath, anticipating the powerful response Harold's call for honor will summon. If Harold Becker's quiet strength resonated with you, please join our community. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us explore moments where honor is tested and dignity truly stands. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next powerful narrative. He stood there, silent as ever, his chest still stained with the protesters' rage. Thick red paint smeared like a wound across the medals he had earned. That voice had cracked, full of fury and judgment, accusing his uniform of being nothing more than a costume for killers. And still, Master Sergeant Harold "Red" Becker hadn't flinched. He hadn't spoken. He let the paint fall and run, soaking the fabric he had worn with pride for more than half his life. A gasp rose from the crowd like wind through dry grass. A city official stepped forward, uncertain. But Becker simply closed his eyes. It wasn't retreat. It was reverence. Like he was hearing something, or someone that no one else could. His silence was deliberate. Behind him, murmurs grew into confusion, then bloomed into anger. But the protester smiled, smug in his defiance, unaware that he had stirred something older than outrage. Red Becker didn't reach for a badge or call for police backup. Instead, he opened his old flip phone, the kind people don't carry anymore, and placed a single call, not to law enforcement, but to history. Minutes later, the very street beneath them began to tremble. The ground shook, not from violence, but from memory made manifest. And when the Marines arrived, they didn't come with words. They came with boots, with steel, with silence. Becker never needed to tell anyone he was a Marine. It was written in the way he moved, each step firm and precise, like every motion still had purpose. At 74, time had taken much from him. His speed, the spring in his knees, the dark of his hair. But nothing had touched his posture or his sense of duty. His boots were still mirror-shined, his spine still straight, his presence still sharp as a blade. He lived alone just outside Kerrville, Texas, in a plain one-story brick house. No banners out front, no plaques boasting of war stories. Just a porch kept tidy, a swing that barely creaked anymore, and a Marine Corps decal on the mailbox, sun-faded but still visible. The house, much like the man, made no demands for attention, but everyone in town knew exactly who lived there. Harold "Red" Becker didn't talk about his medals, not unless someone pressed. And even then, he brushed them off like they were trinkets from another life. But they weren't. He had seen what most wouldn't survive. 2 combat tours in Vietnam, 3 deployments in the Gulf, a Bronze Star for valor, a Purple Heart he kept tucked away in a small, worn wooden box beside a faded photograph of the men he'd never forget, the ones who didn't come back. And that nickname, Red, had nothing to do with the color of his hair. It came from a mission soaked in blood, where he had dragged 2 wounded Marines out of a firefight and didn't stop until the medevac bird touched down, his uniform drenched head to toe. After the military, Harold didn't fade into the quiet. Every week, he showed up at the high school to mentor the ROS kids, those cadets trying to understand what service really meant. Every Sunday, he stood with the old boys at the VFW hall, shoulders squared, handshake firm. And on every holiday that mattered, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, Independence Day, he was always there in full dress blues. Not for show, not for pride. For them, for the ones who couldn't wear theirs anymore. His joints ached. Years of carrying weight had worn his knees down. His right hip had never fully recovered from a training crash in Okinawa. But he didn't complain. He never used a cane. When it came time to lay the wreaths at the base of the memorial, Harold walked them himself, steady, silent, because nobody had to ask. He simply did what needed doing. He was the quiet kind of man who holds a community together without ever asking for thanks. If you didn't pay attention, you'd miss it. But the ones who knew, who really knew, they saw it in the handshakes, in the way every young Marine about to deploy came by to speak with him first. And when they returned, some didn't go straight to their families. They found their way to Harold's porch, because respect knows where it belongs. Maplewood Park was just a slice of green behind City Hall, a few benches, flagpoles, and a modest granite stone etched with the names of hometown sons and daughters who never came home. But on Veterans Day, it became something more, something sacred. By late morning, folding chairs lined the grass. The high school band stood ready, mismatched maroon blazers clashing under the Texas sun, brass instruments polished and glinting. Veterans sat in the front row. Some in wheelchairs, others with canes, all carrying stories in their silence. Behind them, families gathered. Children clutched small flags. Baseball caps bore insignias of units long gone. Memories held tight in stitching and sweat. And at the center of it all stood Harold Red Becker. His uniform immaculate, brass buttons catching the light, ribbons aligned to perfection, and a bearing that spoke louder than any microphone. You couldn't teach that kind of dignity. You had to live it. He wasn't much for words, but today he would speak. He had agreed, though reluctantly, to be the honored guest. Said it didn't sit right with him, but everyone else had wanted it. The mayor had been especially insistent. Even the high school principal came out, his father having served alongside Harold back in '68, reaching out to shake the old sergeant's hand with quiet reverence. The mayor opened the ceremony with a short, solemn welcome, his words read carefully from a crumpled sheet of paper. He tried to strike the right tone, dignified but warm. When the band struck up America the Beautiful, it came out a little off-key, but no one seemed to care. The melody had heart, and that was enough. A prayer followed, then the slow, deliberate roll call of the fallen. Each name echoed through the cold air like a bell tolling. And finally came the laying of the wreath. That was when the shouting broke out. A small group, maybe a dozen, had gathered just beyond the iron fence. Protesters. Their signs were loud, their message louder. War is not honor, one read. No more blood for power. Uniforms are not sacred. Some of them had masks pulled over their faces. Others held their phones high, already recording. Their voices surged, angry, unified, but still just on the edge, loud enough to be heard, not quite enough to be shut down. The police kept their distance, present, but subdued, watching, waiting. Their body language betrayed a quiet discomfort. Harold didn't react, not outwardly. He stood firm, eyes locked forward, gloved hands clasped tight behind his back. But the crowd around him was beginning to stir, uneasy. A young mother drew her child closer to her side. One of the older veterans, face drawn and jaw clenched, muttered something under his breath. The high school band fell silent, their instruments slowly lowered. What followed wasn't silence. It was something thinner, more fragile. The kind of hush that comes when people are holding their breath, not in reverence but in dread. You could feel it, thick in the air, the kind of tension that comes before something breaks. Like the moment before a storm rips open the sky. Most of those in attendance silently prayed it would pass, that the protesters would wear themselves out and move on. But Harold knew better. He had felt this kind of shift before, too many times to mistake it now. He knew when things were about to turn. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones. And in that moment he understood. They weren't finished yet. The first mournful notes of taps drifted into the November air, soft and slow. The bugler stood beside the memorial stone, cheeks puffed as he blew each heavy note into the stillness. The melody hung there, solemn and haunting, echoing faintly off the cold stone and hushed crowd. Even the protesters quieted, just for a moment, as if the sacred music reached out and held them back. But not all of them. From the far edge of the group, someone moved. A lone figure stepped forward. Younger than the rest, early 20s maybe. Hood pulled up over a black sweatshirt, sharp jawline tight with fury. His eyes weren't filled with grief. They burned with something darker. rage. Someone tried to stop him. Another protester, maybe a friend, reached out, grabbed at his arm. The young man shook him off without a word and kept moving. Steady steps, straight toward the platform where the wreath lay. Security was minimal. Two older city volunteers in bright orange vests, caught completely off guard. No one expected anything like this during taps. The protester's stride was confident, deliberate. In his right hand, mostly hidden beneath the sleeve of his hoodie, was a small metal can, the kind you would recognize immediately if you'd ever touched a paintbrush. The bugler kept playing. The young man said nothing, not at first. He waited until he was only a few feet from the memorial, close enough that the clean scent of polish mixed with the sweet rot of fallen leaves. Then, with a voice that cut clean through the final lingering note of the bugle, he screamed, "That uniform is a murderer's costume!" Heads turned. The mayor's mouth hung open, mid-breath. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Hey!" But it was already too late. With a single violent snap of his wrist, the protester hurled the can. It flipped through the air, once, then twice, before bursting open. A heavy ribbon of red paint surged forward, thick and wet. It struck Harold directly in the chest. The sound was sharp, a slap, followed by a wet splash. The crimson paint exploded across his uniform, staining the neatly pressed jacket, slicing through his rows of ribbons, soaking into the leather of his belt and dripping onto the hem of his coat. It clung to the medals on his chest, medals he had polished with care that very morning, draping them in a fresh coat of contempt. The red ran down in rivulets, staining the polished toe of his black dress shoes. For a heartbeat, the crowd froze. A single child burst into tears. A veteran growled, low and animal. The mayor stood motionless, hand half raised, mouth still open. Several in the audience reached for their phones, already filming, but Harold didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He didn't even raise a hand to wipe the cold paint from his chest. He just stood there, eyes forward, back straight, posture locked into a perfect, silent salute. He didn't touch his neck. Instead, he let his eyelids fall shut for a moment. Not from exhaustion. No, what pulled his eyes closed came from deeper within. Memory, perhaps, or mourning. As if something in the air had stirred the ghosts only he could hear. Names not etched in granite, but etched in blood, still pulsing in the marrow of those left behind. Across the lawn, the protester raised his fists high, bellowing, "No more killers in uniform!" His voice cut the air cleanly, confident, and defiant. Even as he slowly began retreating, it was clear he believed he'd accomplished what he came for. The two older security volunteers finally moved in, rushing forward in a flurry of delayed urgency. He didn't resist when they grabbed him. He simply surrendered with a grin, smug and triumphant, as if he'd secured some invisible prize. All around, the silence broke into ripples, subtle and growing, like the uneasy shift before a storm. The bugler lowered his trumpet mid-breath. City officials stood frozen, eyes darting, hands uncertain. In the front row, the veterans were beginning to rise one by one, stiffly, slowly, as though waking from something too painful to remember. Their jaws clenched, their eyes burned with restrained fury. Harold moved for the first time, not to raise his voice, not to throw a punch. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his worn, paint-smudged jacket and pulled out something that looked absurdly out of place. A battered gray flip phone, military-issued, scratched, stubby antenna jutting like a relic from another age. The kind of thing most people hadn't seen in over a decade. He flipped it open with a soft click, a sound both alien and intimate. The screen blinked in monochrome. He didn't scroll, he didn't dial. Just pressed one button with his thumb and brought it to his ear. No one around him knew who he was calling. But those who saw his expression, calm, cold, and sharpened by something ancient, knew this much. It wasn't over. That small gray flip phone hadn't been touched in years, not since the last joint training meet with the Corps down at Camp Lejeune. It wasn't meant for birthday calls or casual check-ins. It didn't even carry a typical number. This device ran on a hardened military protocol, encrypted, point-to-point, used only by a tiny circle of veterans. It was built not for convenience, but for moments like this. Moments that were never supposed to happen. Harold's thumb hovered, a hesitation lasting no more than half a breath. Then he pressed and held. No ringing tone followed. No menu, no music, no human pause. Just a clean, clipped tone and then a voice. Calm, precise, unmistakably military. U.S. Command Liaison. Identification. Harold didn't flinch. Master Sergeant Harold Becker. Code Alpha 74. Retired status. His voice held steady, steady enough to slice through the chaos still settling around him. A breath, then. Reporting protocol breach. Veteran ceremony. Public assault on uniform. Civilians present. Local security ineffective. A pause. A shift on the line. Then a breath from the other end, shorter this time. Understood. Confirm intent. Harold didn't hesitate. Honor compromised. Those two words, the old trigger, the phrase that bypassed debate, cleared all red tape. Not meant for retaliation, not meant for show. It was about what couldn't be allowed to rot, what had to be defended even in silence, even if you stood alone. Location came the next prompt. Maplewood Park, Kerrville, Texas. Civilian presence high. Suspect in custody. Civil unrest possible. The voice on the line shifted, as did the rhythm behind it. Fingers tapping keys, systems being brought online. When the voice returned, it no longer felt procedural. Master Sergeant Becker, it said, this is Major Elias Talland, active liaison, 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit. We're on training ops less than 20 miles east. We're moving now. Harold blinked slowly, absorbing the words like a stone dropped into deep water. How many assets? He asked. Talland didn't miss a beat. Sufficient to ensure presence, protection, and principle. ETA under 10 minutes. You'll know when we arrive. Harold gave a small nod to himself, unseen and unnecessary. Appreciate the speed. You called it, Master Sergeant, Talland said, voice clipped but sincere. We just answer. The line disconnected. No goodbye, no confirmation code, just silence again. Harold closed the phone carefully and slid it back into his jacket, like one might sheathe a blade. The world around him had barely moved. The protester now sat cuffed at the curb, still grinning faintly, guarded by frazzled volunteers and one lone city officer who was still fumbling with his radio. The mayor had taken a step aside, whispering something to a councilwoman who gestured helplessly at the now toppled memorial wreath. The rest of the crowd was fractured, some angry, some anxious, some simply stunned into a fog of uncertainty. But Harold didn't move. He didn't need to, because something in the air had changed. The silence wasn't shocked anymore. It was expectant, and Harold Becker, Master Sergeant retired, stood still in its center, because only he knew what that silence was waiting for. He hadn't called for help. Help was for emergencies, for the broken, for those who surrendered. That wasn't Harold Becker. He had called for honor. And in the world he once belonged to, where men wore uniforms and carried the weight of sacrifice on their backs, that word meant something carved in iron. It meant boots on the ground. It meant steel. It meant the United States Marines were coming. At first, there was only a distant hum, no louder than the low growl of a summer storm rolling over the hills. Most of the townspeople didn't hear it. The crowd remained tangled in confusion and indignation. People were still shouting, arguing with city officials, some trying in vain to console Harold, who stood utterly still. Silent, he had already made his call. What followed now was not up to him. He was just waiting. Then the sound shifted, louder, rhythmic, mechanical and alive, familiar to the few who had once known war. Two children stopped mid-play, their eyes drawn to the sky. Above the rooftops of Kerrville, the clouds began to peel open. Two dark shapes split the morning. Marine Corps UH-1Y helicopters, flying low and with deadly purpose, their rotors slicing through the air like blades. They didn't circle. They didn't hesitate. They declared. Traffic lights swung on their cables. Newspapers lifted and spun from empty benches. Heads turned upward in unison. Then came the rest. From every major street feeding into the downtown square, they emerged. Tactical vehicles, not in the colors of the local police or the muted tones of the National Guard, but in the unmistakable, hard-edge armor of the Marine Corps. MRAPs, Humvees, LAV 25s. Their engines rumbled low and deep, tires pressing down like the weight of judgment itself. There were no sirens. They didn't need sirens. Within 8 minutes of Harold's silent call, the entire shape of the town had changed. City buses pulled over to the curb. Civilians stepped out of their vehicles without being asked. Storefront owners came outside, phones in hand, their screens already recording what would soon flood the internet. Then, like the steady beat of a war drum, came the sound of boots on concrete. Rows upon rows of Marines advanced in full combat gear, uniforms sharp, helmets locked, body armor tight. Each one carried a rifle in ready position, barrels pointed low, not at anyone, but clearly visible. Present, real. They didn't bark commands. They didn't wave arms or shout. Calm and composed, they spread out in formation, encircling Maplewood Park with practiced ease, sealing off the area with precision. The wreaths, the memorial, the crowd. Everything was enveloped by a quiet but undeniable perimeter. No one needed an explanation. The message was clear, without a single word spoken. Even the local police, who had earlier tried and failed to manage the chaos, instinctively moved back. A sergeant from the Kerrville Police Department, her steps cautious, approached the leading Marine officer. Her voice trembled slightly, her hands raised, not in fear, but in respect. "Sir, we weren't informed of this operation." The Marine met her gaze with a nod, firm and respectful. "We're not here to interfere, ma'am," he said plainly. "We're here to protect what's already been dishonored." She understood. She stepped aside. The once defiant protesters, so loud, so certain, now stood frozen. Their signs hung limp at their sides. Their slogans, once shouted, had dried up in their throats. Even those who had mocked the uniform now found themselves staring directly at it, surrounded by a circle of quiet, immovable force. The young man who had thrown the paint, he was already gone, taken away. But his axe still rippled outward, and his cost was only beginning to be measured. There was no panic, no screams, no one ran. This wasn't a raid, it wasn't vengeance, it was presence. A reminder carved in boots and iron that the United States Marine Corps does not forget its own, whether retired or active, and does not stand idly by when the sacred is defiled. Not today, not on a day meant to remember the fallen. Harold Becker remained where he had been all along, erect, dignified in his stained blues, unmoved by the chaos or the spectacle now unfolding around him. He said nothing. He didn't need to. All of Kerrville could feel what was happening, even if they couldn't put it into words. This wasn't about pride. This wasn't about rage. It was something deeper, something true. Some symbols do not fall without a fight, and some men never have to stand alone. The ground itself seemed to pause as the final vehicle in the convoy arrived at the edge of Maplewood Park. From the back of a matte black MRAP, a man stepped down, not with flair or ceremony, but with the quiet command of someone used to war zones, not news cameras. Colonel Jonathan McCabe didn't need an introduction. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't there for appearances. Every move he made was exact, from the way he secured his gloves to the sweeping look he cast around the park, absorbing every detail. The colonel had arrived, and with him the truth walked tall. The eagle, globe, and anchor insignia on his chest caught the first sharp rays of morning sunlight as he strode between the rows of Marines, every step echoing the quiet authority of someone who had truly led men through fire. He didn't have to raise his voice or assert control. His presence alone did it. When Colonel McCabe reached the center of the memorial site, he stopped and turned to face Master Sergeant Harold Becker, whose jacket was still streaked with a vivid red line that bled down through his medals and lapels, an ugly mark of violence on a day meant to honor. Without a word, McCabe brought himself to attention. The salute he offered was crisp, deliberate, and held just a second longer than regulation, just long enough for everyone to understand what it meant. Harold answered it in kind, his return just as steady, just as solemn, every movement laced with pride and defiance. Then McCabe lowered his hand and spoke, not to Harold alone, but to everyone gathered, and perhaps to the entire country beyond them. His voice didn't need volume. It carried because of the weight behind it, like the edge of a blade made of granite. This uniform is not a target. It is a legacy. He paused. The silence that followed was full, heavy. It represents the service and sacrifice of every man and woman who stood when others ran, who bled so that others wouldn't have to, who held their oath long after the war ended. When you strike at one of us, you strike at all of us. The crowd didn't move. His words hung there, sinking into the ground like roots. Then McCade turned slightly toward the wider gathering and continued, his tone unwavering. This community came together today to honor its veterans. And what happened here, this act of disgrace and violence, will not go unanswered. Not by this Corps, not on this soil, not today. As if summoned by his declaration, one of the Marine officers approached and handed the colonel a report. McCade glanced at it, then lifted his eyes across the street toward the officers detaining the suspect. Calm and clear, he addressed the situation. The protester responsible for the assault is now in custody. He will face formal charges, including assault and hate crime enhancement, for targeting a uniformed veteran in a ceremonial setting. Across the street, the protest group that had gathered earlier, once noisy, now thinned out and visibly shaken, released a public statement. One of them, hands trembling, read it aloud into a local reporter's camera. "We do not condone violence or personal attacks. This individual acted alone. His actions do not represent our values." But it was too late, far too late. Whatever credibility they'd clung to had already shattered, broken by the very silence they had ruptured that morning. Mayor Gilbreth stepped up next. His face was flushed with embarrassment, his expression as rattled as the notes quivering in his hands. A hastily placed podium stood at the edge of the ceremony area, and he clung to it like a man barely holding on. "On behalf of the city of Kerrville," he began, his voice thick, "I want to offer a public apology to Master Sergeant Becker, to every veteran present here today, and to the United States Marine Corps. We failed to protect this sacred space. It will not happen again." He turned his gaze to Harold, searching for something, absolution maybe, before stepping back, visibly defeated. No applause followed. No cheers, just silence. Not empty, but resonant. Because some moments aren't meant to be celebrated. They demand reverence. In this moment, and this was a reckoning. By the time dusk fell, the videos had already spread across the internet like wildfire. One clip captured the exact moment the crimson paint splattered against Harold Becker's chest. Another caught the helicopter as it thundered through the air shortly after. At least 5 live streams had broadcast the formation of the Marine perimeter around Maplewood Park in real time, with hundreds of stunned spectators bearing witness through the shaky lenses of their phones. The headlines exploded across every platform. Veteran doused in paint. Marines respond in force, honor compromise. A small town watches a big moment. Protester targets Marine. What happened next shocked the nation. Cable news played Colonel McCade's speech on a loop. His words, "The uniform is not a target, it is a legacy," were clipped and replayed until they became a national soundbite. Talk shows dissected it. Commentators argued over it, debating civil liberties, freedom of speech, military presence in civilian settings, and what it means truly to honor service. The country was torn in two. On one side were civil rights activists and constitutional scholars, raising alarms over the possibility of government overreach and the creeping militarization of public spaces. On the other were veterans, military families, and ordinary citizens who saw the attack as a symbol of something deeper, an erosion of national respect, a widening disconnect between service and society. To them, it wasn't about politics, it was about dignity. And Twitter became a battlefield. Showed up with brushes, paint, and steady hands. They weren't told to do it, they weren't graded on it, they just came. Some brought their parents, others brought bottled water and snacks for those who stayed all day. They worked in silence, heads bowed not out of shame, but out of respect. And as the names came back into view, line by careful line, the memorial began to breathe again. Not just as stone, but as memory. You don't just storm into a town with tanks because someone's feelings got hurt. That's not what happened. This wasn't about offense, it was about assault. A man in full uniform on Veterans Day publicly attacked not for what he said, but for what he represented. There's a line between free speech and consequence, and Harold Becker didn't cross it. He stood still. He made one call. That wasn't retaliation. It wasn't escalation. It was a statement, wordless but full of meaning. That was dignity. The ripples started almost immediately. Veterans from every corner of the country began sharing their stories online. Photos surfaced, some old, some recent, of crisp uniforms, solemn moments, medals, and folded flags. Words poured out, messages of support, fragments of pain and gestures of solidarity. From one old Marine to another, many of them read. Some carried stories that hadn't been told in decades. One man recalled, "In '72, someone spit on me at the airport. I didn't do a damn thing, just kept walking. But I sure wish Harold Becker had been there with me." Sergeant Glenn Hart read, Master Sergeant Sear Fee added simply, "You reminded us all, sometimes the quietest man in the room is carrying the most weight." Laura Colligers, Dana Maxwell wrote, Becker. Thank you, just thank you. But even as voices rose around him, Harold remained silent. He turned down every request, from national networks to neighborhood radio. Reporters waited outside his house. CNN set up camp for a full day, cameras poised and ready. But the porch light never came on. No interviews, no statements, no gestures to the crowd. For Harold, this wasn't about virality or turning into someone's icon. It wasn't a fight for fame. It was about something far simpler, standing up for what mattered. The only time he agreed to speak was at the local VFW post. That Friday evening, in a dim room with creaky folding chairs and walls lined with fading photographs, Harold stepped to the microphone. No press, no applause, just other veterans. People who knew, truly knew, what it meant to wear the uniform. He didn't prepare a speech. He didn't hold a script. He just looked out at them and said, "They say the world's changing. Maybe it is. But honor doesn't change. And as long as even one of us remembers what that uniform stands for, then they haven't erased a thing." Then he sat back down, quietly folded his hands, and listened as the room stood, without a single word, each person rising in reverence. That silence thundered louder than any standing ovation ever could. But the story didn't end with that night. It didn't disappear once the media cycle moved on. In fact, it only grew. What began as a quiet act of strength became a nationwide turning point. Within just a few weeks of the incident at Maplewood Park, a bipartisan bill began making its way through Congress, the Veterans Public Honor Protection Act. It aimed to create stronger consequences for anyone assaulting a uniformed veteran during official commemorative events. But it wasn't just about punishment. It also called for real investment, ensuring local communities had the funding and personnel needed to protect such gatherings, especially during emotionally charged holidays like Veterans Day and Memorial Day. What made the bill so remarkable wasn't where it ended up, but where it began. It didn't come from a think tank. It wasn't born in a polished DC boardroom. It started with a public apology from a small-town mayor and the calm, unshaken response of one veteran. The bill passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support. At the same time, something equally powerful was forming at the grassroots level. Across states, a group of veterans organizations came together to launch a program called Honor Watch. Its mission was striking in its simplicity: bring together volunteer veterans to attend public ceremonies, not to guard, not to intimidate, but to stand, to show up, to quietly remind everyone that no one who served should ever stand alone at the base of a memorial. Each volunteer was given a small red pin. Etched into it was a single word: remember. The first Honor Watch chapter opened right there in Kerrville. Harold never asked to lead it. He didn't even want the spotlight, but they named him honorary captain all the same. Since then, rain or shine, year after year, a small formation of veterans, Marines, airmen, sailors, gather behind the memorial at Maplewood Park. They don't chant, they don't perform. They just stand side by side, because sometimes that's all that's needed. And perhaps the most heartfelt gesture didn't come from veterans or politicians, but from the youngest residents of Kerrville. After everything, the city noticed the memorial at Maplewood Park was beginning to fade. Time and weather had dulled the granite. Names were becoming hard to read. The past was slowly being erased. But one teacher noticed: the middle school art teacher. Quietly, without press or announcement, she organized a weekend project with her students. They brought paints, rags, brushes, and reverence. Dozens of children showed up, many of them having witnessed the events unfold just weeks before. Some had questions. Most didn't speak. They just painted, slowly and with care, restoring each letter, each name, with steady hands and watchful eyes. They weren't there because they were told to be. They didn't need extra credit. They came because they understood, in some instinctive, unspoken way, that memory matters, and that the act of remembering can be as important as the history itself. They came quietly, some with paintbrushes and stencils in hand. A few brought their parents. Several wore rock caps, the kind that had begun to appear more often around town lately. No one gave them instructions. No speeches were made, no signs held. Yet when they finished, just beneath the solemn stone etching that read "Freedom is never free," they had added a simple, imperfect line in gold paint. "We saw him stand. We won't forget." That phrase would later appear on bumper stickers, coffee mugs, and memorial plaques mailed out to VFW posts across the country. But here in Kerrville, it remained untouched. Handwritten, slightly uneven, lacking polish, and all the more sacred for it. Harold Becker never asked to be called a hero. He never made a scene, never raised his voice. But by choosing to remain still in the face of open disrespect, he ignited something that no chant or demonstration ever could. A spark, a reminder, a return, quiet and unannounced, to something older, something steadier, something we used to call honor. It was on a Sunday morning, the kind of morning most would sleep through, that Harold returned to Maplewood Park. The sky was blanketed with soft gray clouds. The breeze was gentle, stirring the flags lining the stone walkway, making them stand a bit prouder now than before. There were no cameras, no podium, no marching band, only the sound of footsteps as an old Marine walked the path alone. But Harold Becker did not come empty-handed. He wore a freshly pressed set of dress blues, tailored with exacting care, and shipped directly from the command office in Quantico. They gleamed, crisp and flawless, the buttons polished until they shone like mirrors. It wasn't a replacement for what had been damaged. It was something else entirely. It was acknowledgement. Along with the uniform had come a letter, brief and without flourish. Your silence spoke louder than any command. Semper Fidelis. He walked slowly, taking in every detail. The bright new layers of paint, the carefully arranged flowers, the American flag now rising straighter and higher than he remembered. He reached out a gloved hand to touch the granite wall, letting it linger over the names carved there. At one name, his fingers paused. A Marine, a friend, someone lost to time, but never forgotten. Then his eyes moved to the far end of the memorial, where something had changed since his last visit. There, mounted neatly on the stone, was a plaque. Modest and unassuming, bronze set flush into the granite. The engraving was clean and solemn. To those who stood for us and still do. Harold stood motionless, absorbing the words. No smile touched his face. He didn't raise his hand in salute. Instead, he simply stood there, still, silent, holding space for memory, for meaning, for what can't be said out loud. A few steps behind him, a boy watched, holding his father's hand. In a hushed voice, the boy asked, "Is that him?" His father nodded gently. "That's him." Harold turned his head just slightly, meeting the boy's gaze. He gave a small nod, nothing more. And then he walked away. Not because the moment had ended, but because, for Harold Becker, it had never been about being seen. It was always about standing firm when no one else would. In a time when shouting often drowns out substance, Harold reminded us that dignity doesn't demand attention. It doesn't yell, it doesn't grandstand. It stands. And sometimes it does so alone. His quiet strength reminded a town and a nation that honor isn't a medal pinned to a chest or a speech given on a stage. It's not a memory stored away or a title earned once and forgotten. It's a choice, an everyday choice, to do what's right, to remember, to respect. This story isn't just about a man in uniform. It's about what we choose to stand for as a people. Respect, courage, legacy. And in a divided world, perhaps it asks something of us. What do we still hold sacred? Some will say it was only a protest taken too far. Others will see in it a call to return to principles we've allowed to slip from our hands. So now we ask, should there be stronger protections for veterans at public events? Or does the right to free speech take precedence, even when it comes at the cost of respect? We especially invite those who've lived through times of war and peace, through division and unity, to share your stories. Have you ever witnessed a moment when honor was put to the test in public? And if so, what did you do? Let's talk, not to argue, but to understand. And if this story made you pause, reminded you of someone you loved, or touched something quiet in your heart, consider sharing it. Because sometimes the most powerful statement isn't a word at all. It's a man standing still when the world looks away.